Welcome to Talking Africa on Arise News, a special weekly edition of Africa Wrap, where we take time to reflect on the fortunes and affairs of the emerging continent within its own countries and across the world in an hour of conversation with African commentators and thought leaders. Time now to welcome my first guest, Stephen Chan, who is a professor of international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He is widely touted as one of the world's leading experts on African affairs and was awarded the OBE in 2010 for services to Africa and higher education. Stephen Chan, it's a pleasure to have you here in the Arise News studios. Now, you've spent much of your life working and living in Africa, advising liberation groups which would go on to become governments. Where did your passion for Africa begin?
It was actually all an accident, being arrested during the protests against the Vietnam War and being incarcerated with a Zimbabwean refugee. So that was the first consciousness raising, as it were, in my youth back in the late 1960s. And it was very, very clear to me that after that, Africa would be a central part of my life.
How did that happen, that encounter in jail, if you like, or in prison police custody?
We were just being held for quite a long time, many, many hours. And we just simply got speaking to each other. He was a refugee from what was then still Rhodesia underneath illegal white rule. And he said he had joined our demonstration against the Vietnam War simply because he wanted to express solidarity with one particular struggle, but that he came from another struggle. And he taught me in great detail about that struggle during the time we were incarcerated. And I think my life changed at that moment in time. And
what did you do? You came out, you packed your bags, and you moved to Africa?
Not quite. I first came to London to complete some graduate studies, and was after that, by accident, I was recruited into the Commonwealth Secretariat. And they sent me to Africa, fortuitously exactly to the transition period in Zimbabwe from white rule to majority rule. I was one of the observers for that foundation election, and that brought Robert Mugabe to power.
Now, you were awarded the OBE in 2010 for services to Africa and higher education. And that was the work that led to, I mean, tell us about what actually led to that sort of major recognition.
Well, as far as I know, the diplomatic side of it with the Commonwealth Secretariat did have some bearing. But I've also been involved in a lot of philanthropic projects. So those also, I think, had some bearing. And involved as what they call a track 2, or an unofficial diplomatic actor, in a number of newly emerging countries: Eritrea after the Stalinist dictatorship, Ethiopia, post-Amin reconstruction of Uganda. That kind of thing goes back a long, long way.
And of course, you were an international civil servant with the Commonwealth Secretariat after the overthrow of Ethiopia's Stalinist dictatorship. And you helped train, as you said, new government officials in Eritrea and Ethiopia. I mean, how would you judge the success of your work there, given what you're seeing in those countries now?
Ethiopia, I would count as a success. The late President, Meles Zenawi, actually attended my lectures underneath the pseudonym. He wanted to be treated like an ordinary student. Very proud of the breakthroughs they've made in Ethiopia. It's not perfect, but I'm very, very greatly distressed by, I think, a dictatorial turn in Eritrea. And that I regard as one of my greatest regrets of my work in Africa.
Tell us what you actually did in Eritrea and where you think it all went wrong.
We pioneered what I call a shuttle modular system of educating the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These were people who until recently had been fighters, that come down from the hills, independence was imminent, and had no idea how to be diplomats. And so I organized a shuttle, as it were, modular system, as I said, bringing in experts from the outside on a periodic basis to teach them how to be diplomats, to organize the ministry, how embassies ran. And that went on for a good 4 years. But round about that time, at the end of that period, it was quite clear that an authoritarian nature was beginning to settle over the government of Eritrea.
Why do you think things went that way and not the way of Ethiopia?
I think precisely because they were very frightened of the success Ethiopia was having. and a great fear that Ethiopia would launch an effort to reclaim Eritrea and to reintegrate it into Ethiopia. Now, I think those fears were unfounded, but because of the very militant attitude on the side of both governments, to be fair, and the military preparedness of both governments, it was only an accident waiting to happen before they went back to war, and they did. And that is to my profound regret.
Now, you're known as something of a rebel in the academic world, if I might use that term. I mean, you've been described as underground and art house. Where does that come from?
I've got two strings to my bow in my academic work. One is to do with Africa, certainly African politics, African diplomacy. The other is to do with international political philosophy. And my books on that subject are very much to the effect that Western philosophy, Western ethics cannot be a universal foundation for appreciating the future of the world. Others have got to have a look in, other very complex thought systems have got to have a look in, and I try to describe those thought systems and the value they can bring to a proper understanding of the world.
And of course, the International Studies Association have awarded you the title Eminent Scholar in Global Development. You've been honorary professor at the University of Johannesburg and Zambia, and you've been a visiting professor at countless institutions from East Jerusalem to Oxford. Now, that is a pretty full schedule. I mean, what keeps you working at that level of intensity?
I think there are things to be done. Also, I think sleep is overrated. So, in the waking hours, I think that it's important in your life to try to, or the old cliche, to put something back. So I try to put something back. And it's not just a life of jet setting. Everywhere I go, I spend time in the slum areas of the cities in which I work. So I try to see life from all perspectives, from that of the high and the mighty, those who've got power or influence, and those who eke out an existence. So I've just come back from Johannesburg, for instance, where I was working at night time in the community centre in the worst part of Soweto.
So what are your thoughts on what's just unfolded in South Africa over the last couple of weeks, this xenophobia that appears to be growing there?
People are dissatisfied with what the government, what the ANC government has provided them. They think that the promise of liberation has not been fulfilled. And so, like in many other places, I don't think it's peculiar only to South Africa. We have a rather racist discourse in our current elections here in the United Kingdom, for instance. But because they're an easy target, the immigrants, they're the ones who get it in the neck. In South Africa, that has a very violent manifestation. Here, it's not quite so violent, but it's exactly the same discourse of they're taking our jobs, they're taking our properties, they're taking our women, they're not leaving anything for us. Whereas the real problem in South Africa is that the government has not been able to provide enough for them.
Okay, Stephen Chan, stay with us. We'll take a very short break here, but when we come back, we'll be talking about Africa's largest trade partner, China. Do stay with us.
The best way to predict the future is to create it. There's a special breed of achievers out there called tomorrow's people. They imagine what will be and strive to make it happen. They refuse to wait for the future. Tomorrow bends and conforms to their ideas. At Access Bank, we share the same sentiments. Our mantra for success is simple: speed, service, and security. Tomorrow's people own the future because they keep the world turning. That is the power of taking tomorrow.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. Now, over the past few decades, China's rapid economic growth and expanding middle class has fueled an unprecedented need for resources. The economic powerhouse has focused on locking down sources of oil and other raw materials. As part of this effort, China has turned to Africa. To date, China is Africa's largest trade partner, and the continent is hosting more than 1,000 Chinese corporations which have invested in Africa's infrastructure, energy, banking and agriculture. Well, with me still to talk about the effects of that scale of involvement is Stephen Chan, Professor of International Relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Much of your life has been spent in Africa, at least a significant part of it. You've witnessed the increase, almost geometric, of Chinese investments. How have you seen these changes affect the continent?
There are many beneficial changes. Half the time you're driving on highways that have been laid by the Chinese. There's going to be a new generation of railways, and those tracks are going to be laid by the Chinese. Soccer stadiums, opera houses, particularly in the Francophonic territories, built by the Chinese. So all that kind of thing is very, very visible. What was also very visible in, say, 1980, in the transition of Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, was when I was running liaison between the various guerrilla armies. They would pull out their chopsticks because they'd been trained by Chinese military personnel and were grateful for the Chinese having come in their hour of need. I think there are certainly problems with the Chinese penetration. In a way, much of it has been very unsympathetic and not properly prepared in any cultural sense. But
well, actually, some people think China's interest is nothing more than a race for resources, and that investments are motivated by selfish interests. What do you say to that?
That's true, except that the upfront, as it were, largesse in which they're putting into this race for resources and the risks they're prepared to take are really quite astounding, and has not stopped yet. When they host the G20 in Beijing next year, I've just come back from Beijing. I'm absolutely confident there's going to be another major announcement of a stepping up of assistance to Africa. They intend to transform the place, not so much for their own benefit directly, although that will come, but they want to change the world's economic geography to rival that of the United States and its domination in the past. And Africa is one means, among others, to try to accomplish that goal.
So there's a geopolitical sort of motive, if you like, behind this, beyond just trying to create the right sort of environment for the resources to be able to come out of Africa into Asia, into China, because obviously you're going to need to be able to move those resources out, and you need the infrastructure to do that.
Exactly. Thus the concentration on things like transport corridors, for instance. But not just in Africa. Pakistan, for instance, major development there. But yes, it's not just a race for resources, which the West would also like to have. So it's a competition in that sense, in a very, very literal way. But it is an effort, I think, to transform not just geopolitics, but the global economic geography.
Now, you're Chinese, and you've spent many years working with influential governments across Africa. What was that like? I mean, I know you touched on the thing that happened in sort of Zimbabwe, where they brought out sort of chopsticks and so on, but did you find yourself treated differently by governments and so on in those places?
No, I mean, I've always been accepted as a little bit eccentric and a little bit odd, and they put that down to being an academic, so that's been very, very helpful. And my wife really won't let me cut my hair, so that's become very much of a signature of the way that I appear. But I think that the real acid test of whether or not people take you seriously is whether or not you're talking sense, particularly strategic sense. And I try to flatter myself that some of the time I do manage to talk strategic sense to governments.
Now, let's talk about the DRC, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Chinese investment there has been flagged as a white elephant. I mean, what difference do you think Chinese investments would have had there, would have made there?
One of the problems with the DRC is that almost any investment is going to become some species of white elephant simply because public administration and government in DRC can't make anything work, whether it comes from China, the United States, whatever. There's a real need for a coherent, joined-up government effort to administer the country properly.
Yeah, but did the Chinese see that?
The Chinese were prepared to take huge risks. I think even they didn't think it was going to be so difficult. The United Nations peacekeeping forces didn't think it was going to be so difficult, for instance. DRC is constantly underestimated. South African diplomacy to try to settle conflicts there didn't see it was going to be so difficult.
But why do you think the Chinese are so reluctant to use their influence to perhaps move the country in the direction of peace in order then to be able to exploit the minerals that they want?
They're prepared to put in a lot of infrastructure. They want to help development, thinking that that kind of constructive, literally constructive activity would allow people to form communities that can integrate and cooperate with one another. Chinese diplomacy in terms of conflict resolution around the world has never been particularly successful. But as I said, almost everybody, every man and his dog, has tried to bring peace to DRC and has failed.
Well, not only is Chinese diplomacy rather complex and difficult to understand, I mean, you also wonder what motivates them when they try to promote good governance and human rights. I mean, they've been criticized, for example, for sticking by Sudan, relations, thriving between Beijing and Khartoum, particularly in light of what was happening in Darfur. I mean, what do you think about that?
But it was precisely the Chinese, after they took a certain amount of criticism, began to understand that they should do something. And the president of that time, Hu Jintao, himself personally went down to talk to President Bashir of Sudan. And in the wake of those face-to-face discussions, President Bashir did begin lightening his stance in Darfur. Darfur remains a problem, but not nearly as intense as it was before the Chinese intervention. I myself went to Beijing as part of a briefing team to try to advise the Chinese on how to change their profile in Darfur, and they were very, very anxious to take on board new ways of thinking about this. So they can learn from experience, but it seems that they're pretty much committed to having to learn from experience. Without that experience, they're not going to make any kind of sea changes in the way they do things.
Now, compared to the rest of the world, growth rates, economic growth rates in Africa are pretty phenomenal. I mean, does the continent need China?
It needs China in a catalyzing sense, even with these growth rates, which look great in a macro sense, but which are very unevenly distributed, not only among the population, but across sectoral aspects of each country. They need the Chinese to fulfill those things that their own sectoral initiatives cannot fulfill. So construction needs the Chinese, transport needs the Chinese. At a key moment in time in the future, hopefully they will not need anyone.
Okay, now just African nations are beginning to push back against China's resource development activity. I mean, Chad took a hard line, for instance, with a petroleum company who dumped crude oil in ditches, and Gabon withdrew an oil field permit due to environmental concerns. Is there a sense that China doesn't care as long as it gets what it wants?
We have the spectacle of Shell in the Nigerian Delta as an example of a company that doesn't care. So the Chinese would not be alone in that. And as I say, the Chinese learn from experience. Gabon is able to push back because it's had senior half-Chinese people in its cabinet. Zhang Ping, who was the Secretary General of the African Union, was half-Chinese, for instance. And the real success story of pushing back on a coordinated policy-based platform has been the Angolans. Their negotiating skills now with the Chinese are absolutely superb. So the more technical apparatus you can put into your preparation, the more language you can put into your preparation, the more successful you're going to be.
Time for another very short break. But when we come back, we'll be talking politics in Zimbabwe.
Wherever and whatever your banking needs, Guarantee Trust Bank will be there, now and into the future. Because you're at the heart of everything we do. Guarantee Trust Bank, proudly African, truly international.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. Now, as we continue the conversation with my guest this week, Stephen Chan, Professor of International Relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies, we turn our attention to Zimbabwe. You were an international servant with the Commonwealth Secretariat and helped pioneer modern electronic observation at the Zimbabwean independence elections, a time of great hope for the country. Tell us about your work there.
We were there from January to independence in early March, and it was one of these very, very strange things where everything was literally made up as it went along. I was part of a small advance party. There were no more than, there was probably less than 10 of us from memory. And we had 1 week to set up the observation before the distinguished observers from different countries would arrive. We had no idea how to do it, so we conducted a reconnaissance of the country pretty much in 1 week flat, and I did about 2/3 of the country myself, and then anchored the observation in the western part of the country, in the two Matabeleland provinces. And that was done on a rotating of observers around each of the different areas where we'd set up offices, and taking quite a number of risks. I must say, some of the elderly observers who were high court judges or senior ministers in their own countries were very, very ready to take those risks for what was at stake. And I think we saw things that the British governor thought we would never see, and were able to take certain actions and give certain forms of advice that were unexpected as a result of our depth of coverage of those elections. But to be very, very fair, we have to say that we extemporized this.
And of course, your observations of how the country's evolved since that time, because beyond, of course, the degeneration into political repression and all of that, and there is a certain sort of fractious nature that's come to, if you like, you know, the main political parties have come to embody since, certainly since the 2013 elections. I mean, what we're seeing now are numerous suspensions and expulsions of party members and all that. I wonder what your assessment of all that is.
It is a fractious political scene, and that's the problem. It doesn't have to be. I mean, Zimbabweans are extremely able people. They're among the most able people I've worked with anywhere in the world. They can do anything they want to do, if they want to do it. But if they want to argue, then by God, they're going to argue. So that the ruling party falling apart, I think, is going to be to the detriment of the ruling party. If this is going to be Robert Mugabe's legacy, that the Liberation Party that brought independence to the country then falls apart underneath his watch, then it's going to be a sorry legacy.
Yes, because of course, earlier this month, Vice President Joyce Mujuru was expelled from the ruling party, and you advised her before she became Vice President.
When she was in her very first ministerial portfolio, she was the youngest minister. She was only in her 20s. She was very naive, and she was made Minister of Youth, Sport and Recreation. So as a very young international civil servant, I was asked to give her some advice and prepare all kinds of papers for her. I was greatly impressed by her sincerity, at least. And certainly I was impressed by the stories of her heroism on the battlefield. She was a frontline fighter. She really did some amazing things that her soldiers swear by. They absolutely swore to me that these stories were true. So as a young man, I came to have some admiration for her as a young woman. Her later career, of course, has been very controversial, particularly in recent times.
Absolutely. And do you think that she is someone who's driven by sort of naked ambition to the extent that she'd want to kill Robert Mugabe?
No. I think that that's a great exaggeration, and it's designed for political purposes. It's a piece of political rhetoric. If she was truly plotting an assassination, she would have been arrested and put into jail now. As a result of these supposed accusations being true, she's merely been expelled from the party. So it becomes a chapter in Zimbabwean politics, which, as I said, probably need not have been written.
Do you see any sort of realistic challenger to the Mugabe presidency? Because Didymus Mutasa, who was formerly Minister of State for Presidential Affairs, has now said he will form a new party to challenge Robert Mugabe. He says the new party would also be called ZANU, but the initials PF, which I think is quite perverse, really, would stand for People First, not Patriotic Front. I mean, what can that sort of challenge pose for Robert Mugabe?
People are speculating in Zimbabwe right now about precisely that question, but I don't think that Didymus Mutasa can mount a very, very strong challenge, simply because at this moment in time, at least, he and the so-called new party don't have the resources. Robert Mugabe can put a huge amount of resources behind his ZANU-PF initiatives, their quest to remain in power, as they did in the 2013 elections. So to muster not only the allies and the popular support, but to build an electoral machine to challenge the president's electoral machine, I just don't see that happening in any short space of time.
You've met Robert Mugabe. What do you think of his future as the president of Zimbabwe?
To speak very, very frankly, I think he's out of touch. I think he has a broad brushstroke picture of what's going on. The detailing, if it were made apparent to him, I think would appall him. The standard of suffering of his people, I mean, if there is such a thing as a standard of suffering, then the Zimbabweans have reached heights they've never reached before in terms of the sheer nature of bereft provision that ordinary people have got to put up with. They've got 20% of what they need for the health budget in the financial year now beginning, for instance. Hospitals are going to grind to a standstill. Nobody would lend them any more money. The Chinese aren't going to lend them any more money, certainly not what they need. They're hosting a SADC meeting, a Southern African Development Community meeting, now in Harare, and there are blackouts greeting the visiting presidents. Everything is running down. Briefly,
if Robert Mugabe is removed from the equation, what do you see as the future of Zimbabwe? Is it going to all fall apart, or will it have a bright future?
No, it won't fall apart, because Robert Mugabe is only the tip of an iceberg, and that iceberg is a very, very strong political party, which is fractured now, that's true, but what's left of it, that is the official ZANU-PF, is still very strong. There's going to be business as usual, and I'll tell you what, the West is going to make it its business to do business with whoever takes the place of Robert Mugabe. Our quarrel with him has become personalized, but in fact the realities of it have long been superseded by far greater international problems that confront us.
Professor Chan, thank you very much indeed. My thanks to Stephen Chan, Professor of International Relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Stay with us to meet this week's Talking Africa panel as we look back at the week that's been, the big stories, the big issues. We continue the conversation in London right here after this short break.
There is a reason Africa is called the new frontier. What was once potential is now an opportunity ready to be seized. Once revered for our resources, today's wealth lies in our people. People who build the cities that shape the future. People who know an idea in one place means business in another. A generation for whom technology means there are no borders, no boundaries. We are the new lions in a brave new world, kings of the urban jungle. And there's a bank that puts the world in our pocket and the future in our hands. UBA, Africa's global bank.
Welcome back to Talking Africa with me, Charles Aniagolu, picking up the conversation in London with our special weekly edition of Africa Wrap, where we take time to reflect on the fortunes and affairs of the emerging continent within its own countries and across the world in an hour of conversation with African commentators and thought leaders. And we move now to troubled Burundi, a country in the east of the continent, in the heart of the Great Lakes region, and a country where questions of politics and power have again led to violence this week. The issue fears that the Burundian President Pierre Nkurunziza will stifle political opposition to his controversial decision to stand for a third term in office, clinging to power or legitimately seeking a mandate to lead his nation again. We'll discuss that in a moment, but first, this from Talking Africa reporter Toyin Amoshon.
On announcing the two-day truce, protesters warned that they would return to the streets on Monday unless President Pierre Nkurunziza backs down on his decision to run for office again. The United Nations says it's alarmed at the Central African nation's political crisis, saying the president was engaged in a brutal crackdown, but it would not succeed in quashing dissent. According to the Burundian Red Cross, at least 7 people have died and 66 others have been wounded in nearly a week of clashes between police and protesters in the capital Bujumbura. Medical sources say many have suffered gunshot wounds. On Friday, sporadic clashes continued in parts of the capital. The university students who were told to leave their campus earlier in the week have been camping outside the US Embassy, saying they want protection. Police say almost 600 arrests have been made, with nearly 250 cases sent for prosecution and 150 undergoing questioning. The remainder have been released.
Those they arrested weren't protesters, they were passerbys. This is what surprises me. Even if they are guilty, they're allowed to eat, and they're not giving them anything. And also the families have a right to visit. All of this scares people, not knowing where we'll be tomorrow.
The unrest broke out after the ruling party designated the current president, Nkurunziza, as its candidate in the next presidential election, which is due to be held on the 26th of June. Opposition figures and rights groups say the president's attempt to stand for a third consecutive term violates the constitution, as well as a peace deal that ended a civil war in 2006. Toyin Amoshon, Arise News.
Well, time now to welcome my guests, James Schneider, the editorial director of New Africa magazine, and the social commentator, Jen Smit. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming in. James, these have been the biggest protests in Burundi since the civil war ended in 2005. Is there any sign of them stopping?
Well, at this stage, no, because the opposition will not back down, and the opposition, both the political opposition and civil society more generally, those not aligned to any particular political party, because the president, as we heard in the report, Pierre Nkurunziza, is going to try to stand again for a third term. and it's felt that either him doing so is explicitly unconstitutional or is against the spirit of the Constitution.
Now, the US position, Jen, is that the bid by President Nkurunziza for a third term violates the Arusha Agreement, a position that's been made clear to the ruling party in Burundi once again. Will this strengthen the cause of the protesters, do you think?
I think international views certainly have an impact. I think people are increasingly aware of the perception of the international media, of international governments, whether it strengthens it, whether that strength helps in any way will remain to be seen. It certainly can't hurt, and it's great that the US government has actually put out a statement condemning it. I think for a country that stands for democracy like the US does, they really have to be saying what they're saying, and anything else would be unacceptable. So yes, it does certainly give the opposition some ammunition, but whether that's enough, we'll just have to wait and see.
And of course, James, you touched on this earlier, but the confusion appears to be between what the Arusha Agreement, which was the basis for ending the civil war, says, and what the Constitution says. I mean, what's the difficulty here that's led to this impasse? What is the ambiguity?
So the Arusha Peace Agreement says that the president can serve 2 terms. It just says that's it, 2 terms. And that was the basis upon which the Constitution was arrived at. The Constitution itself says 2 elected terms, basically 2 terms by universal suffrage. Now, Nkurunziza claims that in his term that started in 2005, he was selected by Parliament, so that it doesn't fall under that constitutional rubric. In his second term, in which he won in 2010 against nobody, he was the only candidate on the ballot when the opposition boycotted the elections over fears that it wouldn't be free and fair, that's his first real term, as it were, and it's not the second one. Now, regardless of how the law comes down on it, and it's now being referred to the Constitutional Court in Burundi, it's clear that the spirit of the Constitution, it's clear that the spirit of the Arusha Agreement is that it would be 2 terms. And the fact that he's going beyond that is causing social and political problems in Burundi, regardless of whether the court comes down and says actually technically he can do another term.
So what would be the country's future if he did stand again?
Well, I think democracy in Africa generally is quite a fragile thing. And if he were to stand for a 3rd term, and if he were to be somehow elected to that 3rd term, it says something about the future of democracy in Burundi. And I think you set yourself up for future conflict. I think there's also a bit of an ethnic undertone to all of this as well. And do we then set the scene for what we saw in that civil war? And that was, the longest civil war. We certainly don't want to go back there. But are we potentially setting ourselves up for that again?
So what is the African Union doing about this, James? Because, I mean, you would have thought that they would be the primary convener of some sort of peace initiative then.
Well, they have. The African Union Peace and Security Council has sent a team, and it is trying to form the basis of some kind of mediation, which is a very helpful position that has been taken by the chairperson of the African Union Commission, which is Dlamini Zuma from South Africa. But then the AU as a whole, maybe it's a bit more difficult because the president is Robert Mugabe, who Zimbabwe doesn't have something to do with term limits. But another reason why it's important for the continent and regionally what goes on is neighbouring Democratic Republic of Congo is scheduled for elections next year, and its president wants to run for an unconstitutional 3rd term. Neighbouring just to north, Rwanda has elections coming up in 2017, and its president, Paul Kagame, possibly wants to run for an unconstitutional 3rd term. And then just the other side of Rwanda in Uganda, again next year, more elections for Yoweri Museveni, who's already been in power since 1986, having changed the constitution so he could run again. He's running again. So it sets a very important precedent for the region, and the other leaders are looking at it.
That's a very good point. Do you think, Jen, that anyone can change the ruling party's mind? Is there some level of negotiation between between the UN, the AU, the ruling party and the opposition that might lead to some sort of middle ground?
I fear that any sort of negotiation is going to be largely cosmetic, because power is quite addictive, and I think that party wants to be in power, the candidate wants to be in power, and it's very hard to try to persuade them otherwise. So I'm not sure whether a negotiation is really going to get anywhere.
If there is change, I think it will come from within the army. It looks like, if you look at the response the army has had to the protesters rather as opposed to the police had to the protesters, it looks like there might be some differences of opinion within the army about whether this is absolutely necessary. And I think if there's anything that pulls Nkurunziza back from the brink of the third term, it would be that. But at the moment, it's very difficult to say whether that is even possible.
Okay, for the moment, stay with us. We'll take a very short break here. But when we come back, a new life for the child soldiers of South Sudan. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. Now, in South Sudan, more than 280 former child soldiers have returned to their families in Peeble. They've started taking part in educational and social programs to help them settle back into their communities. Several militias have been fighting the government since South Sudan won independence in 2011 after decades of war with Khartoum. For Talking Africa, Lucinda Bowden reports.
Fresh bread to mark a fresh start. At a special centre in the eastern town of Peeble, these former child soldiers are part of a group of nearly 300 children who've been released from the ranks of the Cobra faction militia and reunited with their families.
I'm very happy to be released from the militia.
The children have now started taking part in a reintegration programme that's teaching them life skills and offers counselling as well as leisure and social activities.
By the end of this process, we will have worked with up between 2,000 and 3,000 children being released from armed groups. They're still identifying children in some areas, so the figures are not complete. And of the 1,300 children released so far, the vast majority of those have returned home to their families. A significant number of them have started to attend school, although there were challenges in resources in education in Greater Pibor. But things are progressing. The challenge now is for us to sustain it.
The demobilisation programme's been ongoing since January. The latest group is part of nearly 1,800 former child soldiers who've been demobilised since the start of the year. According to the United Nations, some of them have been fighting for up to 4 years, and many have never attended school.
We continue to have focus on ensuring that these children are given the opportunity to get a better future for themselves, and that the Greater Pibor area then can be a model for the whole of South Sudan, that children do not belong with guns in their hands.
The UN estimates that 13,000 children are associated with armed forces throughout South Sudan. Warring parties have been recruiting children to fight since the conflict began in December 2013. As the campaign to stop using children as soldiers and release those being held by militia groups in the region continues, for those on this reintegration programme, there is hope of a normal life. Lucinda Bowden, Arise News.
Well, still with me in the studio are James Schneider, the editorial director of New African magazine, and the social commentator Jen Smit. James, there's hope for a few hundred children who've been released, but with thousands still tied up in the civil war, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult to see how the futures of the children who are fighting can be divergent from everybody else who's fighting and everyone else who's affected by the fighting. The fighting is likely to calm down in the next month, but sadly not because of any human factors like a successful negotiated peace or some kind of justice system being brought in to try or to try to curtail the actions of the leaders of either side of this civil conflict, the President Salva Kiir or the former Vice President Riek Machar, but it's only going to slow down because the rainy season is going to start, which will make fighting more difficult until towards the end of the year, when it's likely that fighting will start up again. So this is a very good news story for these few hundred children, and there are efforts that can be done, and some children can be brought away from armed groups. But fundamentally, to stop there being child soldiers in South Sudan, the conflict itself has to stop.
And that really is the crux of the matter, isn't it? I mean, clearly these particular children that have been, if you like, rescued are also offered counselling as well as an education. Do you think they'll ever fully recover from being forced to fight at such a young age?
I don't think anybody who goes through this experience ever fully recovers or forgets, and that's the important part, they don't forget. But I certainly think that children with the right support can still go on to lead successful lives, but it is crucial that they have that counselling support, because what they have experienced is during the most formative years those are incredible things that most adults would never have to go through, and because they take place during those formative years, it's even harder to get over them. But with the correct form of counselling, with support, with education, and talking about these things, I do think those children have a chance, even though they will never ever forget what happened.
And of course, James, you've had first-hand experience of actually talking with some of them, you know, child soldiers in general, not these particular ones. I mean, is it your sense that they can lead a normal life?
I think it's possible that they can lead a normal life, but of course, I mean, it depends on what the country's situation and how they find themselves. I think actually the difficulty that child soldiers in South Sudan will face is quite similar to the difficulty that adults and actually the whole country as a whole faces, because it's suffered from conflict for over 50 years, first with two very long-standing, very brutal civil wars within the United Sudan, then also during those conflicts, a sort of civil war within South Sudan between different factions, and then now really the conflict hasn't stopped, hasn't really stopped with independence. So you have a very large proportion of society that has been conditioned by violence and who knows fighting as the primary course of activity. And I think transitioning from that is very difficult for society as a whole. And I think we can't really draw a distinction between the children who fought now and the young men and even the older men who fought, because the whole country needs to, a different set of incentives and a different psychology needs to be provided, and the country needs to provide for itself.
And James, I'm going to follow up with this question to you, because you touched on this earlier, and that is the fact that there was some kind of agreement between President Kiir and the rebel leader Riek Machar, signed in 2008, banning the use of child soldiers. What do you think's happened to that?
Sadly, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Agreements between the two men, there have been many. Since in December 2013, this civil war started between the two sides. There's been endless peace negotiation agreements, generally organised by IGAD, the regional bloc, and nothing has come out of it. Well, lots of pieces of paper have been signed, but the fighting hasn't really stopped and the conflict continues. And the reason why that is both sides, both principals in this conflict have impunity. They're able to get away from it. And they know that when the fighting stops, that may be the only time in which people are able to pick them up for it. And so they have this bizarre incentive where they need to carry on fighting, but they need to make it look as if they've got one foot in a peace camp. And until the international community and the African Union and the regional partners are much, much firmer with these two, which is actually what an African Union Peace and Security Council Commission of Inquiry led by former Nigerian President Obasanjo tried to do, and it got kicked under the table, was really put a lot of pressure and say these individuals are the cause of this conflict and they need to be removed from the political situation, because really without that there might be makeshift peace. Things might stop because it's raining, but a durable peace and therefore durable nation building can't happen.
Okay, stay with us. There's still a great deal more ahead here on Talking Africa this week, as we ask our guests to look back across the last 7 days and pick out a few of the many positive African stories that have caught their eye. Stay with us.
Thinking of banking in Africa? Then think Zenith, one of the biggest in Nigeria, with assets over $16 billion, listed among the 20 most influential brands in the world, and winner of Best Bank in Corporate Governance. The most customer-focused bank in Nigeria, a success built on 3 foundations, dedicated to people, technology, service. Zenith Bank, in your best interest.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News, as we continue the conversation with my guests this week, James Schneider and Jen Smit. And we ask you both to highlight some of the positive stories that have come out of Africa over the last 7 days. And Jen, you wanted to talk about skateboarding in Jozi. And of course, Jozi is Johannesburg.
That's right.
For ignorant people like me who don't know.
Well, it's always so great looking for positive stories from Africa, because there are so many, but so often the focus is on the negative ones. And this is a story that actually it's about Skatistan. Now, Skatistan was started by an Australian in Kabul who noticed when he was there skating around the interest particularly of young girls who saw him skating on a skateboard and were intrigued. Now, of course, there's a little bit of cultural, I'm not sure what quite the word is, but
cultural issues.
Yes, cultural issues around women and girls riding bicycles. And he thought, well, this is a way around it. Let's get them on a skateboard. That there can be no complaints about that. And it was a way of teaching about gender equality. The program has since spread. It's been to Cambodia, and now it has come to Johannesburg in South Africa.
And of course, it has won numerous awards now, hasn't it?
It's won several awards. It's won a UN Golden Doves Award. It was actually a documentary in, I think it was 2011 perhaps, was shown at the Sundance Film Festival as well. And it's just a really interesting way of teaching children about the world around them that is so much bigger than the village that they live in, and about gender equality. And they tend to partner it with arts education programs as well. So kids are learning things that they probably wouldn't learn in schools. It's very much more about fitting in culturally, about what other people understand, believe, do. So it's just a really nice feel-good story.
Brilliant. Now, James, what caught your eye in the last week?
A couple of things from Chad caught my eye, which was, I thought, interesting, because Chad doesn't get covered very much in the Anglophone media, and when it does, it tends to be things to do with the military. Chad are involved in the Central African Republic, in Mali, tackling Boko Haram. But there are a couple of good sort of economic stories that came out. One is the finance minister, Bedorma, who's currently running to be the head of the African Development Bank, negotiated debt relief of over $1 billion, which is very good news for the country. But I thought more significantly, they've managed to renegotiate how much money they get from out their oil. So they've got this big concession, which is with the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, a big state-owned company, and they've managed to get the royalty rate up from 12.5% to 14.25%. This is after kind of 2 or 3 years of playing quite serious hardball with the Chinese, and they've been arguing, no, we can get a better deal, and they have got a better deal. And I think that's something that they could, other countries can learn from this Chadian example, and hopefully Chad can share some of their expertise and how they've gone about it, because they've won a better deal, and it's very important that they get this better deal because the oil price, as we all know, has come down.
And hopefully use the money wisely.
And hopefully use the money. That's perhaps the other aspect of the story, which may be less good. The money tends to go into the Chadian military, but still, the fact that it's there is a positive.
Well, I'm always very sceptical about sort of big oil windfalls, because they often end up like a lottery win, but certainly the general idea is a good one. And Jen, something else to come out of Africa this week is Afros, transforming Africa through digital media. Tell us more.
Yeah, well, in an increasingly digital world, and especially in Africa, where actually you've been able to leapfrog some of the technologies that are available, one way of reaching young people and educating them about the world around them is through digital content. And gaming, there's a lot of talk these days about how gaming can actually help people. And so Afros is a way of talking to youth in Africa in their own language. And I don't necessarily mean in Xhosa or Sotho, whatever it is, but in
I love that clicking noise. It's something I just can't do.
I can't do it all the time. But teaching or reaching young people in a way that makes sense to them as citizens of Africa, not something that's been adapted from the West, which doesn't really resonate. And it's talking to them about issues that they may face in their day-to-day life. So whether that's gender inequality, whether there's substance abuse, domestic violence, teenage pregnancies, but all in the form of gaming. And that speaks to the youth part, and it also tackles that whole, this is something that's not, it's not created elsewhere in the world, it's created for me. And
James, I'm going to bring you in a minute here to get your reaction to this particular story. But Jen, I'm going to ask you to talk about this, which is quite interesting. The South African Airways has banned the transport of hunting trophies and all its carriers. Is that a leap in the right direction, do you think?
Well, this story caught my eye because at first glance you think they're taking a moral stand, and actually perhaps if you've been following on social media, there's a lot of talk about, from Ricky Gervais, one of the people who's been talking about why are people glorified for shooting animals and so forth. So you'd think it's actually SAA taking a moral stand, we won't transport these goods. But actually what turns out is that it's because they were fined. There was a shipment of what they thought was machinery. It was going to Perth, arrived at the other side of Perth. It was discovered it was ivory, and therefore SAA was fined. So it's more a commercial decision than a moral one.
Well, they won't be able to take their gory gory trophies home, and won't we all feel terribly sorry for them that they can't take a giraffe head and stick on their wall? Shame.
Thank you very much indeed. My thanks to James Schneider and Jen Smit. Thanks to you both for coming in. Thanks also to Stephen Chan, Professor of International Relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies, who joined me earlier in the program. We're back every night with Africa Wrap at 1800 GMT here on Arise News. From me, Charles Aniagolu, and from the entire team here in London, goodbye and thank you for watching.